Okay, forgive me, I ran over, did not announce a break, and so I'm going to go back and repeat. It's a little tough. That's why you see me looking over, trying to get everything in. That last minute, minute and a half goes very quickly, and then before you know it, poof, I'm out. So we have to re-engage. So anyway, I hope you did take a little break. Let's go back now, just for a quick minute. We've spoken about the judgment on Judah, and we spoke briefly here about the cause, working evil from their beds. Our time in the bed in Psalm 63, verse 6, tells us that, here's the contrast. What evil men working evil in their own bed, mischief, when we're supposed to have time with God, when we rest our head on the bed. You see the two ways to go. But we know that right here is what's been going on, is that this harlot has gotten a hold now, this idolatry that's hidden. God's exposing it, and Micah is proclaiming it. So, as we move on from verse 1 of chapter 2, the rest of it says, let's just read it. Woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their bed. When the morning is light, they practice it, because it is the power of their hand. Now, in verse 2, and they covet fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his own heritage. This is government that he's speaking of. All right? They're all wrapped up in everything false. Idolatry, perverted government. In verse 3 it says, therefore thus saith the Lord, behold, against this family do I devise an evil or calamity, from which you shall not remove your necks, and neither shall you go haughty, for this time is evil. He's telling us we have a picture. What happened then, an exact picture of what's happening right now. In that day, listen, shall one take up a parable against you and lament with a doleful lamentation and say, we be utterly spoiled. He hath changed the portion of my people. How hath he removed it from me? Turning away, he hath divided our fields. And therefore thou shalt have none that will cast a cord by lot in the congregation of the Lord. They begin to recognize now the course and the cause of the judgment that's upon them. In verse 6 he says, prophesy you not. Say they to them that prophesy, they shall not prophesy to them, that they shall not take shame. O thou that art named the house of Jacob, is the Spirit of the Lord straitened? Are these his doings? Do not my words do good to him that walks uprightly? So he's saying, if you think you're going to blame me for the mess you're in, you better think twice. He says, because I do right to those that walk uprightly. And even of late, my people is risen up as an enemy. You pull off the robe with the garment from them that pass by, securely as men averse from war. The women of my people have you cast out from the pleasant houses, from their children. You've taken them away, and my glory forever. Listen, in verse 10, he says, arise you and depart, for this is not your rest, because it is polluted. It shall destroy you, even with a sore destruction. In verse 11, if a man walking in the Spirit and falsehood do lie, saying, I will prophesy unto thee of wine and of strong drink, then he shall even be the prophet of this people. A false prophet is what he's saying. A false prophet. If you want to believe that, remember, the false prophet, like the harlot, get their power from the serpent. The counterfeit, the false prophet, the counterfeit bride, all of these things that have come into focus as we read further in the New Testament. This is old, in Thessalonians and in Revelation. And we see these things, these repetitive themes, almost exactly word for word. And then he goes on to indicate there's a promise of future restoration. So you have judgment, the explanation of why the judgment, what's going to happen, and now the restoration. It's a complete picture, all right? In verse 12, he says, I will surely assemble, O Jacob, all of thee. I will surely gather, listen now, gather the remnant of Israel. Remnant. How often and where do we most read about a remnant? In Revelation. I will put them together as the sheep of Bozrah in the flock in the midst of their fold, and they shall make a great noise by reason of the multitude of men. The breaker has come up before them. They have broken up and passed through the gate and are gone out by it. And their king shall pass before them, and the Lord on the head of them. Oh my goodness, the imagery here of this promise is amazing. Listen, remember what we said in Luke. It says, straight is the gate, narrow is the way, and few are they who will find it. The remnant will find it. He's speaking of this remnant. The same thing he's saying out of the gate. In the midst of their fold, they're passed through the gate and they're gone out by it. And their king shall pass before them. Who is their king? Who is their king in the time of their deliverance? And the Lord is at the head of them. So they have the king, the Messiah, their Lord, is leading them. All right? Leading them. Both of these are in the Luke narrative and Matthew as well. So now we have references into the gospel and further on into the depths of Revelation. The Lion of the tribe of Judah, the king that returns, their Lord. That's the promise of the restoration. Now, not speaking of the remnant, but now we come back to the judgment. And in chapter 3, we see the judgment on the princes, all the people. And I said, here, I pray you, O heads of Jacob, and you princes of the house of Israel, is it not for you to know judgment? Who hate the good and love the evil, who pluck off their skin from off of them and their flesh from off their bones. That's an idiom, all right? It means to basically to oppress. When you pick the skin off someone, you're oppressing them. They eat the flesh of my people. Same thing. Oppression. And they flay their skin from off them. And they break their bones. They chop them in pieces, as for the pot. And there's flesh within the cauldron. Then shall they cry unto the Lord, but he'll not hear them. He'll even hide his face from them at that time, as they have behaved themselves ill in their doings. So he separates them out, talks about those that will come through the gate, the remnant, and then he speaks about the judgment on the rest, all right, who did not come, who did not fulfill, who did not believe. Now, he goes top down. In verse 5, we begin to see the language of judgment on the prophets themselves. Okay? He says, thus saith the Lord concerning the prophets that make my people err, that bite with their teeth and cry peace, and he that puts not into their mouths, they even prepare war against him. Okay? In verse 6, listen now. Therefore, night shall be unto you, that you shall not have a vision, and it shall be dark. You'll not divine, and the sun shall go down over the prophets, and the day shall be dark over them. Yet another reference to Revelation, to the darkness that overcomes the entire earth. And then shall the seers be ashamed, and the diviners confounded. They'll cover their lips, for there is no answer of God. But truly, I'm full of power by the Spirit of the Lord. Micah is saying now, the Spirit of the Lord is on me. I'm full of power and of judgment and of might to declare unto Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin. And that's what he's doing. That's what this book of prophecy does. You know, we really do have to face ourselves. We have to ask ourselves the same questions. Are we guilty of these things? Are we walking circumspectly? Are we doing the things that have been asked of us, knowing full well that times are late and things are moving very quickly? So now, after all that, there was the promise of restoration, but now a promise of a future judgment in verse 9. Micah says, hear this, I pray you, you heads of the house of Jacob, talking to the leaders, and the princes of the house of Israel, that abhor judgment and pervert all equity. Right? All equity. They build up Zion with blood and Jerusalem with iniquity. The heads thereof, remember the heads are leaders, judge for reward, and the priests therefore teach for hire, and the prophets divine for money. Yet will they lean upon the Lord and say, is not the Lord among us? None evil can come upon us. In their deception, many will fall away. And even in the house of Israel. It says, therefore Zion for your sake be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem become heaps, and the mountain of the house of the high places of the forest. He's tearing it all down. He's telling them, you're sitting here, false prophecy, divining, ministering for money. It's upside down. Just like our world today is upside down. It's the same premise. Now, after all that, yet again, in chapter 4, we begin to see the promise. He begins to speak about the promise of the coming kingdom. And this is why it's very important to understand how the prophets move. They speak in contemporaneous terms. They speak for today. They speak of yesterday. They speak of the future. And it's all one as it's delivered from God. And in chapter 4, verse 1, we see this because it says, but in the last days it shall come to pass that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established in the top of the mountains, and it shall be exalted above the hills, and people shall flow to it. Now, where else do we know of that? We know of that once again, Revelation. And he says in the last days. Those days are now. And this was 8 centuries before the Messiah. So that's about 3,000 years ago, pointing right to today. And it says, listen now, many nations shall come, and they'll say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, and to the house of the God of Jacob, and he will teach us his ways, and we will walk in his paths. Listen, for the law shall go forth of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So in Zion is the word, is the law, all right? Moses and all that Israel was, their entire culture, in its purity. It will walk hand in hand with the word. And who is the word? The word is the Messiah. The word, Jesus himself. So you have to have them both. Why? Because what did we learn over and over again? That the goal of the Torah, all right, the result, the objective of the teaching and the instruction and the way to live was way to live as good a life as you can in anticipation of the Messiah who will deliver and save us. But we have to have a heart for God. And it says, well, Paul says, is the law ever going to go away? God forbid. No, it's forever because it's God's word. So we have this blending, all right, this blending. And at the end of the day, we see that in the New Testament anyway, when we look about the middle wall of partition, all right? And in Revelation, again, it says, who has the law and the prophecy, all right, together. You can't have one without the other. The Torah is supposed to lead us to the Messiah. You can't have the Messiah and claim to be a follower without God's rules and laws and ways. We learned about that because we learned what sin was. And there's the harmony of it. And it's spoken of right here, 8 centuries before the Messiah. And listen in verse 3. So we're proving this now. And he shall judge among many people and rebuke strong nations afar off. Well, who does that? Whose calling is that? But he who sits at the right hand, who comes here, back to this earth, to rule and reign. And now we hear about what we've learned and heard for many, many years. Sometimes we misquote or we don't know quite where it comes from. But it says, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, and neither shall they learn war anymore. Why? Because he's pointing to a future time, a millennial reign, spoken of where? In Revelation, very clearly. It says, but they shall sit every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts hath spoken it. And when he speaks of the vine and the fig tree, he speaks of the production, the produce of the land, the peace of living in peace in the garden, living the way we're supposed to. It says in verse 5, for all people will walk every one in the name of God, of his God, and we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. So what we have during this millennium is very clear as well. What we taught, and that even though the Messiah is going to be living, reigning with us right there, people are still going to have a choice. And it does say that when it's all said and done, that those who reject even the Messiah, who live with him, number as the sands of the sea. And we hear it qualified right here in Micah. Listen to it. It says, all people will walk every one in the name of his God, little g. All right? But we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. Forever and ever. There's a qualifier. Basically, it's saying if you're walking in the path of your own God, whether it's you or an idol or a false religion, you're not walking very far, because it only says that we who walk in the name of the Lord our God, the one Lord, right, forever and ever. Odd, all right? Evermore, everlastingness, for perpetuity. It's the word odd. In Strong's Hebrew, ever is number 5703, and it means forever, time passing on, world without end, continually and never ending, all right? Never ending. And in Isaiah 9:6, the Messiah is called the everlasting Father, which in Hebrew is Abi-Ad, literally the Father of eternity. And Ad here is what we mean by the word ever. So we have that here. We see that total picture of the future. You're going your way, and we're going to eternity. It's pretty simple when you think about it, all right? So now, after the promise of the second coming, he goes back and he talks about the promise of the coming captivities. He's back now in his time, looking forward. And it says in verse 6 of chapter 4, in that day, saith the Lord, will I assemble her that halteth, and I will gather her that is driven out, and her that I have afflicted. He's speaking of Jerusalem now. I will make her that halted a remnant, and her that was cast off for a strong nation, and the Lord shall reign over them in Mount Zion from henceforth even forever. So he's restating it, that while there will be captivity, while there will be affliction, he's gathering once again, what? remnant. The remnant. And in verse 8 he says, O thou, O tower of the flock, the strong hold of the daughter of Zion, unto thee shall it come, even the first dominion. The kingdom shall come to the daughter of Jerusalem. Verse 9, Now why dost thou cry out loud? Is there no king in thee? Is thy counselor perished? For pangs have taken thee as a woman in travail. All right? And we see that same imagery of the woman in travail, giving birth with the dragon waiting for him to try to devour him, but it doesn't happen. He's asking him, what's the matter? Don't you trust in the king? Don't you have a king? Be in pain and labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail. For now thou shalt go forth out of the city, and thou shalt dwell in the field. Thou dwell even to Babylon, and there you'll be delivered. There the Lord shall redeem thee from the hand of thine enemies. So he's telling them, you're going into captivity, but I'm going to deliver you. It says, Now also many nations are gathered against thee, that say, Let her be defiled, and let our eye look upon Zion. So he goes from the past captivity to other nations to the distant future, which happened when many nations gather against Israel and Jerusalem. But they know not the thoughts of the Lord, and neither do they understand his counsel. For he shall gather them as the sheaves unto the floor. It doesn't matter who comes against them. It doesn't matter, right? If God be for you, who can be against you? Well, that same promise he's giving here to the remnant of Israel. And says, Now, arise and thresh, O daughter of Zion, for I will make thy horn iron and thy hoofs brass, and thou shalt beat in pieces many people, and I will consecrate their gain unto the Lord, and their substance unto the Lord of the whole earth. So, this is a tough word, right? A tough word. Zion is pictured as a threshing animal with a metal reinforcing its hoofs and its horns. Will be threshed so that their valuables fall out like kernels of wheat under the threshing hand. And we know that this is happening. This is a cleansing time period, right? But he says, I'm going to strengthen you. And when I do, it's going to be tough on the rest of the nations. So what you go through, you'll go through. You'll have your captivities. You did that. I will deliver you. And that brings us up to chapter 5. Okay? And let's look quickly at the first, maybe 3 verses, which are seemingly, we don't know why they're there, but when we look at it in retrospect of what we've spoken about and what he's showing in and out, it makes sense. It says in chapter 5, verse 1, it says, Now gather thyself in troops, O daughter of troops. He hath laid siege against us. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek. They shall smite the judge of Israel with a rod upon the cheek. And the very next statement, verse 2, is about the birth of the Messiah. But thou, Bethlehem Ephratah, though thou be little among the thousands of Judah, yet out of thee shall come forth unto me, that is to be a ruler in Israel, whose goings forth have been from old, from everlasting. In one statement, in one verse, in one chapter of Micah, he pronounces the birth of the Messiah in Bethlehem, or Beit Lechem, which means house of bread, all right? And though you be little, the greatest of all will come from you. His goings and his comings have been from old, for everlasting, because the Word was with God in the beginning. And then in the very next verse, one verse, we see the rejection of the Messiah. From the birth to the rejection, the deliverance, the birth, the rejection. Therefore, verse 3 of chapter 5, will he give them up until the time that she which travails has brought him forth. And then the remnant of the brethren shall return unto the children of Israel at that time. All right? Bring forth, give birth in the future. And then we go to verse 4, and this picture unfolds even more. We told about the birth of the Messiah, the rejection of the Messiah, and the work now of the Messiah. Here it is. He shall stand and feed in the strength of the Lord. Listen, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God. Speaking of the Messiah, standing in the name of the Lord his God. Please note that. And they shall abide, for now shall he be great unto the ends of the earth. Listen now. And this man shall be the peace, Prince of Peace. When the Assyrian shall come into our land, and when he shall tread in our palaces, then shall we raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. Before we talk about that, let it be known here that Assyria is a collective term, because the Assyrian captivity and conquest of Israel happened way before Micah, right? And what we have here, when we understand Assyria symbolically being representative of hostile nations against Israel, I want to tell you that there's 5 things that are mentioned about the Assyrians, all right? There's Moloch, there's Belial, there's Mammon, there's Beelzebub, and there's Satan. And each one has a meaning. The Moloch is a king, all right? But Belial is worthlessness. He's the king of worthlessness who lusts in wealth. Mammon is lusting in wealth. Beelzebub, the lord of the flies, or death, all right, from Satan, who is the enemy and the adversary. Moloch, king. Belial, worthless. Mammon, lust for wealth. Beelzebub, lord of death. Satan, the enemy. Those names are key to Assyria and Assyria's relationship to the Jewish people. So he speaks of that. He speaks of that. And he says, then we're going to raise against him 7 shepherds and 8 principal men. I would not, and I've done a lot of research on that. That is very similar to for 3 generations, even for 4. He's going to raise up, symbolically or otherwise, shepherds to the people, principal men, leaders, okay, to take hold. And they shall waste the land of Assyria with the sword, and the land of Nimrod and the entrances thereof. Thus shall he deliver us from Assyrians. And when he comes into our land, and when he treads within our borders, we're going to be delivered. Okay? And again he says in verse 7, and the remnant of Jacob shall be in the midst of many people, as the dew from the Lord, as the showers upon the grass that tarries not for man, nor waits for the Son of Men. And then the remnant of Jacob shall be among the Gentiles, the nations, in the midst of many people, as a lion among the beasts of the forest, as a young lion among the flocks of sheep, who if he goes through both, treads down, tears in pieces, and none can deliver from him. None can deliver from him. Okay? So we're setting a stage here for what is to come, and we will talk when we pick up again, starting in verse 10 of chapter 5 and through the end of it next week. You'll see, again, many more references to the imagery and the symbolism within Revelation and the stark reality that Micah is speaking about it centuries and millennia before. Anyway, we're soon to be finished for the night. I hope this is a little bit of an eye-opener. It gets a little more interesting even as we go. So until that time, may he who makes peace in high places make peace for you. And we'll see you next week. So be well, be blessed, and let's see what the Lord has for us in the Word next week. Okay, good night.